So it's time to talk about the civil rights movement. This will be our first lecture on the civil rights movement. We're going to talk about kind of the early glacial movement of the civil rights movement in the post-war era, how we begin to move toward the beginning of the civil rights movement. And I always start my presentation and discussions on the civil rights movement with this picture, two water fountains. All right. Um, but before we get to these two water fountains, I kind of want to give you just an umbrella view, very simplified view of what's going on in our country um, in the early part of the 20th century. In the latter part of the 1890s, we saw a lot of southern states disenfranchise African Americans, which kind of culminates around the turn of the century in states adopting new constitutions, like Alabama's Constitution in 1901, which is an attempt to disenfranchise African Americans. We see a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan through the teens and 20s. And really, you couldn't get an elected dog catcher in the South if you didn't have Klan affiliations, right? So there's a resurgence of racism, of African Americans make gains under Reconstruction and at the end of the Civil War, and slowly there's an erosion of their rights, and there's a resurgence of white supremacy and a resurgence of racism and whatnot. And we really kind of have just lived through that as well. Um, I think some commentators, some historians talk about um, one of the reasons President Trump was so popular with white, middle age, and older Americans is because he's kind of a direct reaction to the Obama presidency, right? Had a black president, and there's a lot of older people who, without a doubt, have some ingrained sense of racism and a desire to return the United States back to the way it used to be, to make America great again. And what that means is that we all have jobs and we all make our stuff and we're the dominant economy in the world and we take care of the U.S. first. And the United States is a white Christian nation. So all through the early part of the 20th century, well, the 1890s and the 1900s, we kind of saw a reaction to that, and that kind of continues on all through the early part of the 20th century, to the 20s and the 30s, until we get to World War II. World War II is a watershed moment. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But the law that kind of establishes and sets out the way a lot of race relations will be, and especially, and the thing that's going to be challenged in the early part of the civil rights movement is the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Plessy versus Ferguson was about, we've talked about it before. It took place in New Orleans. It was about streetcars and having a separate streetcar for African Americans and a separate streetcar for Caucasian Americans, and which one people could ride on, whether that was acceptable. When you hear the words Plessy versus Ferguson, three words should come to mind: separate but equal. Always separate but equal, separate but equal, separate but equal. Separate but equal is the doctrine established by Plessy versus Ferguson, and basically it's this: as long as you have an equal facility for everybody, you can have separate facilities based on race, right? So here you go. This brings us to our picture of the water fountain, right? Here is a water fountain. There's two water fountains there. You have a water fountain for white patrons, and you have a water fountain for colored patrons, right? The colored water fountain and the white water fountain come from the same, one would assume, municipal water source, right? It is the same water. The only difference is the difference in the water fountains themselves. The white water fountain has a refrigeration unit. That's why it's so big. I know you never would have got that because you've probably never seen a water fountain like that. I'm old enough to remember some water fountains that looked like that, though they were old at the time. The water fountain is refrigerated for white people. The colored water fountain is not, but it comes from the same water source. It's the same thing. And as long as it is equal, everybody can get water, so they can be separate. But they do not have equality They do not have sameness. And see, this whole gray area of all this stuff is just so um, splitting of hairs. Anyway, so this is an example of the way Plessy versus Ferguson was put into practice all through the South, right? You can see it. If you ever go down to the Jefferson County Courthouse, you can see it. You will see a large bathroom, a men's bathroom and women's bathroom, and you will walk 3 steps down the hall, and there's a single bathroom men and a single bathroom women's. That goes back to when the Jefferson County Courthouse building was segregated, and there was a separate black bathroom, a separate white. There was a nice big white bathroom, and then there was a one-holer for African Americans, right? And you can see that all over the building. You can see that in other places, right? If you know where to look, buildings that are old enough. All right. Another example of Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, is facilities like this, right? If you were an African American family on the travel and you had to travel and, you had to stay in a hotel, this is where you were going to stay. Places like this, the Beansville Inn Cabins for Coloreds, right? You're not going to be able to stay in the regular hotel, in the regular inn, which is in town. You got to stay in the Cabins for Coloreds. I got to tell you, I'm sleeping in the car. Who knows what is inside that shack, right? But this is the type place that you would have to stay if you were African American and you had to travel, right? The facilities are equal in that they both probably have a bed and they both provide a place to stay, and they're more than happy to take your money, but they're not the same, right? So you can have separate facilities based on Plessy versus Ferguson. All right, so this is kind of the situation when we go off to war in World War II. And when we return from World War II, many Americans are beginning to change in their attitude, be it looking at the overt and awful racism of the Nazi regime or the Japanese racism of the Pacific War. I think for some people, it's witnessing the racism of other people and how awful it could be. I think for other reasons, it's the fact that there are many people who see African American members of the military who were very valuable and successful in the war, be they the Tuskegee Airmen or the Red Ball Express, or be they someone serving in the Navy, there or the tank destroyer units. There are people realize that African Americans have a valuable, can play a valuable part in American society. And listen, don't for a minute think that this is going to solve racism. That people want to solve racism and to kind of coin a joke, invite somebody over and invite a young African American man over to marry your daughter. We're not there yet in 1945. Most people are still what we would consider to be racist today, without a doubt. But there's this sense that it's wrong, that segregation is wrong. And there's this sense of wanting to change it, right? And so after witnessing after World War II, there's this acceleration of this feeling among white America that the African American community in America is treated incorrectly, and that we need to do something about this, right? So we see little baby steps through the 40s that are going to kind of culminate in something in 1954. All right. The next little baby step is Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson integrates baseball in 1947. The Brooklyn Dodgers signed him to play professional baseball in the major leagues. There was an all-black Negro leagues, right? The museums here in Birmingham. The Birmingham or the Birmingham Barons or the Birmingham Black Barons, either one were the Negro League team. So you have this this desire to get good players in, and you have an organization, the Brooklyn Dodgers, who are willing to break color lines. They get Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson is an excellent baseball player. Don't let what I'm about to say to you belittle him in any way. He is an excellent baseball player. He is a excellent baseball player. He is not the best baseball player in the Negro Leagues. That was probably a guy named Josh Gibson who had a horrible temper, had problems with alcohol. no baseball team could sign him. He would have been a disaster, unfortunately. Robinson not only is an excellent player, but he really has the right temperament for this. He's able to absorb kind of the abuse, and though I'm sure it infuriates him, he doesn't lash out and act out because of it. Because he is going to face lots and lots of ridicule and overt racism. By the way, if you've ever seen the movie 42, which of course was partially filmed out at Rickwood Field, um, the manager, I think, of the Pittsburgh Pirates, who in the movie is when Robinson comes to bat, is yelling the N word at him over and over again, is a guy named Chapman, Ben Chapman. Ben Chapman Drive is in Hoover, Alabama, over by the Met. When you turn into the Met parking lot, going up toward the Finley Center and the RV park, that is Ben Chapman Drive, named for him. He moved to Hoover after that. There you go, small world. All right. Okay. In another move in 1948, Truman desegregates the military. All through World War II, African Americans had served in black-only units. In 1948, Truman says this is not a good way to have a military, and integrates the military, and it upsets a lot of people, right? But again, we're having these little baby steps, which is going to lead us eventually, in a couple of years after this, to a landmark Supreme Court ruling, and we'll get to that in the next one.